they got all the records 10 years ago.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this party conference meeting of the Bruges Group. Well, the debate is certainly hotting up, and it's looking somewhat different from 1975. Then Wilson and Heath got away with murder. They deceived and deceived and deceived again to keep Britain in the European community. Today, I don't believe people are quite so trusting of their politicians. They know that politicians can be serially dishonest, and the expensive scandal has left its mark. Truly, we now have a great opportunity to win this referendum and set our country free. When I voted night after night against monetary union, I knew how damaging it would be for the whole of Europe, and so it has proved to be. 20 years ago, monetary union was largely an abstract concept to most of our people. Now they have the evidence it does not work, and every day people can also see the chaos that comes from open borders. I and my colleagues at that time changed the law so that no British Prime Minister could take us into the euro without the backing of a referendum, and no Prime Minister has dared to take such a course. 3 years ago, largely due to the efforts of a small group of MPs, a referendum was secured on the question of our membership of the European Union. Now we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to break the shackles and restore self-government to our country. And let us welcome to our cause those from all parties and those with no party. Remember, it was Hugh Gateskill, the leader of the Labour Party, who said that joining the European community would negate 1,000 years of British history. How right he was. Now today, ladies and gentlemen, we have two outstanding speakers. First, Mr. Jim Mellon, a renowned international investor. Many people who manage companies or other people's money describe themselves as international investors. But Jim is different. He largely invests his own money and sinks or swims as a result of his own decisions. Jim is immensely forward-looking. Some of his favourite investments include biotech and robotics. He has been referred to as Britain's Buffett. This reflects his international standing, although I should add, he does not wish to be associated with some of Mr. Buffett's personal eccentricities. Okay. Despite his international outlook, Jim remains quintessentially British. His father, Sir David Mellon, was a leading Foreign Office official involved in our original negotiations to join the European community. When choosing speakers, the Bruges Group likes to invite those who may have some degree of rapport. However, it was only yesterday I discovered that both Jim and Dan are graduates of Oriel College, Oxford. Jim has gone on, as with other causes, to be a most generous benefactor to his college, and is now a High Fellow. Ladies and gentlemen, may I ask you to give a very warm welcome to Jim Mellon.
you very much, Barry. Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much to the Bruges group, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to listen to me. I'm the warm-up act for Dan, who is, as you know, is an outstanding speaker on political and other issues. Normally I talk to people about whether they should buy the Japanese yen or Fujitsu Fanak or short the Swiss franc or whatever. And so this is very unusual for me. This is the first time I've ever spoken on a sort of or quasi-political issue. I'm not in politics, I'm a businessman, and I'm going to stick to business. I'm not looking for anyone's vote. And although Aaron Banks is a friend of mine, but I have no particular view as to which one of the organisations that's going for the No campaign is the one that should triumph and be the voice for No. So I'm agnostic about the way in which we get to a No, but I'm pretty pro the fact that we should get to a No. That having been said, when I started work in 1980, my boss was a man called Richard Thornton, a very mercurial character. And his phrase, which I repeat often and always remember, is that foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of a small mind. And so if the facts present themselves, such as we should stay in the European Union because by some miracle David Cameron renegotiates a better deal for us, which is really genuinely better, and not just the Neville Chamberlain bit of paper from 1936, then I think we should relook at the issue. And none of us should be so hard-headed and ideological that we can't see a future in a free trade, less regulated, less federalist European Union. But I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't think it's going to happen because David Cameron, and I do admire him, I think he's been a good Prime Minister, and for heaven's sake, I hope he is not replaced in any form by Comrade Corbyn. But I think that David Cameron has, from a business point of view, and that's what I do, given the game away. Because imagine this is a microphone that I want to buy or sell. He's already said that whatever the price is, he'll either buy or sell it at. So they know that they don't really have to negotiate at all in Europe. And in fact, whatever comes back will be a fudge. How they dress that up to an intelligent populace that's well educated in what Europe is about, I don't know. But I do sense that the No campaign is gaining momentum. And before I started talking, Dan said to me, it's important that business leaders come out and say that there is a growing number of business people in this country and elsewhere who say it doesn't really make much difference to business whether we're in or out, and in fact it may be a good thing. Today you saw in the newspaper that Jeffrey Immelt, the head of one of the biggest corporations in the world with 17,000 employees in the UK, said it didn't really matter to them. And of course the people who are advocating a staying in Europe are those wonderful forecasters who suggested that we should be in the Eurozone, and the wonderful forecasters who suggested that we should be in the Schengen zone, all of whom have been proved wrong, all of whom are historical revisionists, in other words, they're sort of saying, hedging out what they actually said in the 1990s or in the early 2000s. And they've all been proved totally wrong. Imagine a world in which we're in the Schengen zone and we're in the Eurozone. It would not be a world that would be very pretty. I'm going to make an economic argument today. I'm going to make an argument which is based on hard-headed economics, so that's what I do. I was trained in economics, and I'm a businessman, and I read a lot of economic stuff. Now, I may be wrong, but I'm going to make an economic point. There are lots of political points about the European Union, which Dan will make much more effectively than I do, which is basically that it's become, rather than an economic project, which it was in 1957, with the associated objective of avoiding another Third World War based around the combatants that have been fighting for so long. And it's become now an economic project. And it's an economic project that has only one purpose in its centre, which is to make Europe totally federal. Now, from a broad economic point of view, that is just not possible. You can't impose on 28 countries with different languages, different cultures, and importantly, very different levels of income. So, for instance, Luxembourg has a GDP per capita of 100,000 US dollars, and Romania and Bulgaria have GDP per capita of $7,000. You can't impose this uniform approach, and at least you can't impose it as quickly as the European Union would like to impose it. And the result is that we're already seeing fractures in the Euro project, evidenced earlier this year in the Greek situation. And at the end of this little talk, I'm going to talk about a much more important situation, which is that two of the major countries in the European Union are perilously close to bankruptcy. And the reason that we should vote no, forget about immigration and all the other dog whistle stuff that a lot of people use and which could be thrown back against you. The reason we should vote no and that we should leave the European Union, at least as it's currently constituted, is because we will be dragged down in the wake of the coming economic implosion of these two very large members of the European Union if we stay in it, even though we're not in the Eurozone. And we have to, and we can, avoid that fate. So I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, but let's just quickly run through some of the basic political issues which everyone knows about. The main argument is, of course, economic, but there are other constraints on business which are quasi-economic. The regulatory burden, the fact that half the laws are made in the European Union now that influence the United Kingdom, our inability to negotiate bilateral trade deals, our inability to bring in the people that we choose into this country. And believe you me, immigration is a really important foundation on which this country was built. But at the moment, we have to take everyone from the EU, and we could take very few from the software developers in California, the Indian technology people, the professors from Australia, and so forth, because we have to impose this restraint due to the unlimited numbers that are coming from the 550 million people in the European zone. So all these factors are well known, and all factors, I'm sure, that are dear to your hearts. But the really, because time is short, the really important argument I want to make is on the economy. Now, we can't really influence the European Union. We have less than 10%, in fact we've got 8% of the votes in Europe, so we can't change the way in which it's going. We can't change its headlong rush into federalism. And we can't change, despite the fact we're not in the Eurozone, we stayed out of it, the way that Europe is developing. And the way it's developing is as follows. The fact of the matter is that since 2000, Italy has not grown at all. But Italian debt burdens have grown enormously. And Italy has fallen into what we economists call a debt trap from which there is no exit. France is in exactly the same situation. Both those countries have about 130 to 140% of their GDPs represented by debt. That's a high proportion, but it's not as high, for instance, as it is in Japan, where Japan has a 220% ratio of debt to GDP. Now, the big difference, and the reason why it's so critical for Italy and for France, and most people don't talk about this, is that the Japanese essentially borrow, the Japanese government borrows from its own citizens. So 99% of the Japanese government debt is owned by Japanese people. So if they can't pay it back, they just say, all right, we're changing the interest rate, or we're going to make it a 100-year debt or 500-year debt, or whatever. They can monetize it, they can do whatever they want, because they only owe it to their own people. It's not the case in France and Italy. France and Italy, of their government debt, approximately half, slightly more than half, is owed to foreigners. And the maturity of that debt is, on average, for both France and Italy, about 7 years. At the moment, they pay almost no interest on that debt because they have the blanket ECB coverage, which basically guarantees that whatever it takes, Mr. Draghi will keep the Eurozone intact. The problem is that they've fallen into what is known as a debt trap because they have no economic growth. Their nominal GDP is not growing fast enough to conflate any part of that debt. In fact, the debt is growing. And sooner or later, as with Greece, the international credit agencies and the people who lend money to France and Greece will begin to say, this debt is absolutely unrepayable. How can we ever get our money back? And the next time they come up, next year or the year after or the year after, their ratings will start to suffer. So the French rating will go down, the Italian rating will go down, and eventually it will lead to higher interest rates. And at that point, when French interest rates go to 5 or 10%, there is never going to be a solution to the repayment. Now, between those two countries, they owe 4.5 trillion euros of debt, of which, as I said earlier, about half is owed to foreigners. I believe that they can never repay that, and I believe, as a result, there is going to be a cataclysmic implosion in the Eurozone at some time in the next 5, 10, or 15 years. Even though we're not in the Eurozone, as I said, we will be dragged down, if we're still in the European Union, in the wake of that cataclysm. In fact, the breaking up of the European Union will be dragged down because we will be forced to help the bailout. Germany can't do it on its own, and in the Greek bailout, France and Italy were key contributors to the bailout, and obviously they'll be being bailed out themselves. Spain can't bail out France and Italy. So there'll be no one else in the European Union, apart from us, for them to turn to. It would not be a good idea for us to do that, because I do think that this will result in a 10 to 20% depression in those two countries. They are being effectively, as we know, beggared by their larger neighbour, Germany, which runs an 8% current account surplus every year, and which recycles that into making unwise investments in French and Italian and other corporate bonds around the peripheral countries of Europe. So there is going to be a monumental economic crisis. Now, you might ask, well, why am I forecasting that? What's my credentials in doing that? In 2006, I published a book called Wake Up, which foretold of the US housing crisis leading to an economic crisis around the world triggered by investment banks going bankrupt. And it actually happened. And a year and a half ago, I suggested that the euro was massively overpriced, and the only thing that was going to happen was that the Europeans would start doing QE, which they have done, and that the euro would depreciate. And sure enough, it's depreciated by 30%. But that's not really enough, because 3/5 of the world is depreciating its currencies against the US dollar, trying to export deflation to other parts of the world, and not succeeding. So at the moment, what you have in Europe is basically the banking system is not fixed. They haven't recognised their non-performing loans to a sufficient level. They're going to require massive recapitalisations. You effectively have zero growth, and any growth that is occurring is what I call dead cat bounce growth. It's not genuine growth. And you have this disparate level of both debt and economic income in the various parts of the European Union. It is not sustainable. And the main argument I, as a businessman, and a reasonably successful one, although I've made many, many mistakes in my time, I'm making is that that debt is so unsustainable for the key components, or for key components of the European Union, that it will never be repaid, and it will lead to the inevitable implosion of the European Union, and we don't want to be in the European Union when that happens. So that's the businessman's argument. I'm not making arguments, dog whistle type arguments about immigration or the Queen or our national sovereignty or human rights or anything like that. Those arguments can be made by others, and they're very effective arguments. I'm making the hard-headed economic argument. My main asset is in Germany, as it happens. Germany is a robust country and will continue to be so. And my vision is that when this implosion happens, and it will happen, but instead of having 28 disparate countries, the European Union is reformed as a free trade zone with some political agenda that we all accept, but just for the important constituent nations that were the first founders of the European Union plus Great Britain. So I don't want us to be out of a European confederation, not a federation, but a confederation forever. I want us to be on the sidelines while they reorganise themselves, as they're going to have to do, and then to come back in and help reshape a better Europe. I do not believe that David Cameron will come back with anything other than a Munich bit of paper. So as a result, I am supporting no. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim, for that brilliant analysis. I know much of what Jim had to say was new to many of you in the audience, but we've received that unique and highly professional analysis and from my limited knowledge of business and economics, I think that Jim is pretty close to the truth. Our next speaker, Dan Hannan, is truly one of those speakers who needs no introduction. Earlier, I mentioned the events of 20 years ago, when I and a small group of colleagues did everything we could to stop monetary union happening. Dan was too young to be a member of Parliament at that time, but he was an extremely active person in university politics, and he sent me and others a constant stream of supportive messages. When the personal abuse against the Maastricht rebels was particularly intense, he even sent my wife flowers. A truly great man. Thank you, Dan, for all your support at that time, and more importantly, ever since. Dan, you have gone on to devote your life to this cause, which is so important to everyone in this room, and we are all in your debt for doing so. Your record of support for and contributions to the Bruges Group are absolutely outstanding. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Daniel Hannan, MEP.
Barry, thank you for those very generous words. How close you and your colleagues came. Maastricht on 2 occasions went through with less than 3 votes, and imagine what heartache we would have been spared had a few more people had the courage to join you in the lobbies on that occasion. Thank you for putting this meeting together. And thank you to Jim. Think about what we've just heard. Jim is not another politician. He's not somebody living as I am on the public purse, although I'm hopeful that you will all soon put me out of work and release me to do something else. Jim's career is based on spotting when it's a good time to invest and when it's a good time to sell. And when he's telling us, as it were, to dump our shares in the European Union and start purchasing our shares in the rest of the world, he, of all people, has earned the right to be listened to on this subject. If Jim is telling us that he looks across the channel and sees a failing project and that we would be better off standing aside, that, in my book, weighs more heavily than any number of bromides from politicians of different parties. I discovered minutes ago that Jim and I were both at Oriel College, Oxford. Not, I think it's fair to say, the most distinguished of all Oxford colleges. It had a reputation for being a rather sleepy and not terribly academic place for much of its history. But it did have 2 very famous alumni. One was Cecil Rhodes, and the other, even more, was the man who can claim as much as anyone to have begun Britain's global engagement, Sir Walter Raleigh. I wonder what they would think if it was seriously proposed that their country would retreat from its global vocation, narrow its horizons, and focus all its energies on the western tip of the Eurasian landmass. Because that is the logical consequence of contracting out our diplomatic, our commercial, and our political life to EU institutions. And I'm not sure that this point is fully appreciated even now, after 43 years of membership in it. I don't know if you saw the news coverage that surrounded the Chancellor of the Exchequer's recent visit to China. It was widely written up and discussed, particularly by broadcasters, as a trade mission to China. But of course, it's not a trade mission if you can't sign a trade accord. A rather obvious point, one might have thought. All of the talking, all of the photo opportunities, all of the sponsorship of football grounds and all the rest of it cannot disguise the fact that only the European Union can sign treaties on our behalf. When we joined, we effectively surrendered our commercial policy, and with it, our right to speak and vote in the World Trade Organization, to the European Commission, where we are currently represented by a Swedish former sociology professor. When you think, I mean, we've been hearing a lot about the slowdown in China, but when we think that slowdown or no slowdown, China this year will grow at 6.1%, next year at 6.5%, while the European Union has been flatlining for 6 years, that tells me that we are in the wrong place. We are a global nation, linked by habit and history, by language and law, by commerce and kinship to every continent and archipelago, but we can't pursue that global vocation as long as we are bound by a protectionist common commercial policy in Europe. Last year, the European Union announced that it was shelving its free trade talks with India. India grew at 4.6% this year. The European Union, to remind you, didn't grow at all. Now, is there a country in this part of the world that stands to gain more from unrestricted commerce with that rising giant than ours? India is, certainly for commercial purposes, English-speaking. It's common law. It shares our commercial practices and our unwritten ethics, our accountancy mechanisms. It's the fourth largest investor here. It owns Jaguar, it owns Tetley. There are 1.4 million Brits of Indian origin, but we cannot sign a free trade agreement with India or with anyone else because we gave that power to Brussels on the 1st of January 1973. Now, the EFTA countries, they're in a much happier situation. They enjoy free movement of goods and services and people and capital in Europe. But they are able to go further. If they think that the EU is being unduly protectionist in its relationships with other countries, they can go further and sign more comprehensive trade agreements, as they have done. In July of last year, free trade agreements came into effect between Switzerland and China and between Iceland and China. We can't do that. And the EFTA countries are confident of signing a comprehensive FTA with India this year, but the European Union isn't even talking about it. Which of those arrangements would suit us better? A country like this one, maritime, global country, how is it that we have become so despairing of our ability to impact the world that we think we can only make a difference, we can only have influence, contracting out our affairs to Brussels? Maybe the answer to that question has to do with the despair, the pessimism that prevailed in this country when we took the decision to go in. I'm not sure that we had a lower moment ever as a country than the 1970s. We've pushed from our minds the sheer unmitigated awfulness of the Heath Wilson years, the 3-day week, the prices and incomes policies, trade unionists being better known household names than cabinet ministers, double-digit inflation, the utter despair. I can just remember as a small boy hearing and being shocked to hear adults saying, "Britain's finished. It's going to the dogs." And it was in that pit of total despair that we took the decision to go in with the European project, to hitch our wagon to what we hoped would be a powerful economic locomotive. I wonder whether we'd have made that decision either 10 years earlier or 10 years later. I wonder whether the sense of necessary national despair would have been there. But what we can say for sure is that we joined at the worst possible moment. Western Europe had indeed grown spectacularly between 1945 and 1973, the year that we joined, bouncing back from the artificial low of the Second World War. It effectively stopped growing with the oil shock in 1974, and it never really properly got going again. And the markets from which we had crazily stood aside, not least the common law English-speaking markets of the Commonwealth and Anglosphere, were just in the 70s beginning a takeoff that lasts still to this day. Here are some slightly scary economic statistics. In 1980, there were 9 members of the European Union, and among them, they accounted for just over 30% of the world economy. Today, There are 28 member states, and they account for 17% of the world economy. And the trend is all in one direction. In 2006, the European Union was taking 64% of British exports. By 2012, that had fallen to 44%. Ladies and gentlemen, that in my book qualifies as a collapse. What's it going to be 10, 20 years from now? And we're still going to be having this debate about whether we should merge our entire polity with the European Union because it's accounting for what? About by then, 15% of our exports? How much lower does the figure have to go before we raise our eyes and rediscover that global vocation that our parents took for granted? Let me put this another way. You should judge any organisation by its record. We sometimes have a habit in this country of fantasising about the European Union we would ideally have liked, rather than dealing with the one that has in fact taken shape. One of the arguments that one gets very often, I've had it a lot in the last 24 hours, is people saying, yeah, okay, I share your analysis, it's corrupt and it's undemocratic and it's not growing and so on, but surely we should get in there and reform it. Yeah, brilliant. Why has nobody thought of that until now? Ladies and gentlemen, that has been the policy of every British government from Mellon onwards. Even before we joined, right? Get in there, make a few concessions, win friends and allies, and then try and transform it into a wider, more free trading, more globally minded body. If you had listened to any politician, Labour, Conservative or Lib Dem, at any point in the last 40 years and you said, what's your vision of Europe? Almost certainly he'd have replied, Europe of nations. A network of sovereign countries cooperating to do what they can collectively, but each respecting it out. Great, lovely, If that had been on the menu, we wouldn't be here, would we? We wouldn't be having this argument, we wouldn't be having this referendum. You would all have better things to do than be sitting in this room listening to me. But it's not on the menu. We've got to shake off this age-old British problem of taking our eye off what's happened on our doorstep and imagining something that we might ideally have preferred. The referendum, when it comes, is not going to be about a better European Union that exists in our conceit. It's going to be whether we intend to be part of the one that is actually there and we can see where it's going. This is a really critical point. The EU is not a fixed and changeless dispensation. It is an evolving dynamic. Its leaders are making very clear, in the most flagrant, public and vocal way they can, that we're not going to stay as we are today, that there are going to be big changes, further massive transfers of power from the national capitals to the EU institutions, that they're going to have a common tax policy, that they're going to have more powers in policing and criminal justice and immigration, that there's going to be, of course, a finance ministry and debt pooling to deal with the euro crisis. So there's going to be a common European army. This was Jean-Claude Juncker last month. He said, we need a European army to show Putin, right? I mean, we're not actually going to use it, but it'll really make Putin think. Well, it's only make him think. I wonder what it'll make him think. I mean, I'm not any kind of expert on Putin's psychology, but my guess, if you really forced me to take a stab in the dark, is that few things would cheer the Kremlin more than Jean-Claude Juncker saying to NATO, guys, we'll take this from here. But then what do I do? But the point I'm making is that we can see the direction of travel, right? So that people will often say there's a status quo bias in referendums. People are change averse. They're more easily scared than they are inspired by hope. Okay, fine. Let's accept that may be part of how we're made up. But if you want to stay where you are, you don't do it by remaining a part of this organisation which is very plainly moving. Think of the EU as a bus, right? It's written the destination in big letters at the front, as they do. It's made very clear, they keep telling us, Angela Merkel, Jean-Claude Juncker, the rest of us, that they want a political union, they want to take on the attributes and trappings of statehood. Now, if you remain stationary on the bus, you in fact do move, don't you? If you want to really stay where you are, you have to get off the bus. And that's the choice that we're going to face in 12 or 18 months' time. Judge this organisation by its record. Be empirical about this, right? This is something that Britain's good at. Look at the evidence. The EU and the integrationist project was based on above all, two great pillars: the monetary union and the border-free zone. Those were the greatest achievements, we kept being told. The pillars on which a united Europe would rest. How are they working out? We were told two things about them. First, that they would make us all richer. Free movement of goods and people would complement monetary union and price recognition and so on, and the euro would, incredible as though this now seems the European Commission told us when the euro was launched that it would add 1% to the GDP of every participating economy every year in perpetuity. Okay. And then Schengen. You know, this was going to be the thing that would bring us all together. National differences would dissolve. We'd all be one happy family. Look at how German newspapers are now writing about Greece. Look at how Greek newspapers are now writing about Germany. Look at the relations between Hungary and the other Central European states and Austria and Germany. Would you say that this move towards closer integration has soothed or stoked national animosities? Is it making Europeans get on better or worse? Now you might say, well, why are you talking about the euro and Schengen? We're not part of those things. Well, how long do you think that opt-out will last if we give our consent to the thing? But leave that aside, that's not my point. My point is, extrapolate from that record. Infer from it. Judge the EU as we would judge any organisation by its record to date. Is there anything in that story that tells you that these are the best qualified institutions and that these are the right men and women to put in charge of this country? The premise on which we joined has been falsified. The prosperity we were promised has emerged despite, rather than because of the European Union. It's emerged in the countries that didn't join the euro, and it's of course emerged most of all elsewhere. Every continent on the planet is now experiencing economic growth except one. Ladies and gentlemen, we're in the wrong place. We don't sit on great natural resources in this green, damp, exquisite island of ours. We have to make our way in the world by what we buy and sell. And that means we have to be where the customers are. And it becomes increasingly clear with every day that passes there are fewer and fewer customers in Europe. Look around you in this building. You have recalled in the iconography of Manchester Town Hall the self-confidence of a great Whig liberal city at the time of our economic expansion. You see in the murals downstairs the great story of a confident Victorian people asserting the reasons for their supremacy, above all, trade. Just out there in the square before the town hall is a statue of John Bright, one of the greatest sons of this city, the man who first adumbrated and exported that sublime idea of freedom that reached its fullest flower during Margaret Thatcher's premiership. What would those city fathers, those great, peaceful, prosperous, hard-working men, who owed their success not to conquest and rapacity, but to providing a service to others at an agreed price, what would they think, seeing our country retreat from the world? We're told so often, we need to be part of a big bloc. We're too small to go it alone. Too small to go it alone. Ladies and gentlemen, we are the 5th largest economy in the world. And current trends will be the 4th largest in 2030. We're about to overtake Germany. We're the 4th largest military power in the world. We're one of 5 permanent seat holders on the UN Security Council. We're one of the group of 7 industrialized nations. We have unparalleled links with the United States, the English-speaking world, the Commonwealth. We have the best universities here. We have the strongest soft power, the best brand recognition. How much bigger do we have to be before we are able to live under our own laws, trading and cooperating with our friends and neighbours, but governing ourselves? If Switzerland, with some 8 million people, if Norway, with some 5 million, or Iceland with 330,000, or Jersey or Guernsey, which seem to be doing pretty darn well outside the European Union, if they are able, just through free trade and self-belief, to furnish their peoples with the highest standard of living in Europe, how much more could this country, a nation of some 64 millions, a trading, maritime people, connected to every corner of the world? Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are.
Thank you, Dan, for that excellent and emotional analysis of the problems that we face and the destiny that we should seek to fulfill. Now, it's your opportunity to put questions to our two excellent speakers. Who would like to ask the first question? Yes, I'll take a question from the gentleman standing there by the wall with the blue shirt.
Thank you very much, David Farley, member for Vauxhall. I want to ask your opinion on a particular particular way to go forward on trade. If we believe in free trade, if we believe in the rule of law, if we believe in democracy, there is actually only one way that we should be doing trade, and that is a unilateral declaration of free trade to be aspiring for the world to follow our lead. It is economically the case. But just because someone charges a tariff on us doesn't mean that we should be charging a tariff on them. We do not need free trade deals. We don't need to go to China. We don't need to go to America. We certainly don't need to go to the European Union. These free trade deals, these multilateral trade deals, particularly the European Union, are a vehicle for vested interests to have their say and have their pound of flesh.
Thank you.
And yeah, I just the view on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Jim, would you like to kick off on that?
I completely agree with that, but you have to remember that Britain at the moment is not a huge trading nation. About 10% of our GDP is related to exports, and 90%, of which, by the way, half are in services as opposed to physical goods. We have a large trade deficit, as I know you're familiar with the rest of the world, and that's something that's not really talked about a lot. But a big part of that trade deficit is with Europe. About £80 billion last year. So the idea, which is touted by some people, that we're going to lose 3 to 4 million manufacturing jobs, which is basically all manufacturing jobs, because we leave the European Union, is absolute tosh. Because there's no way that the Germans, the French, and the Italians would want to cut off one of their, if not their most important customer, just for the sake of spiting their noses, etc. So I completely agree that free trade would be a very good spur for the United Kingdom. I thoroughly endorse what you're saying, with one qualification, which is that the agricultural industry is probably a little bit too fragile in this country to support a non-tariff environment immediately, so we probably have to be phased in. But for the rest, and at the moment around the world, the average tariff on traded goods, excluding agriculture, is about 4.2%. We should be, absolutely, I'll vote for you in Vauxhall. I think it's a very good point to make.
Thank you, Jim. Dan?
Even the Brussels-funded think tank that first came up with the ludicrous 3 million jobs dependent on the EU, or dependent on trade with the EU statistic, has now disowned it. That doesn't stop Nick Clegg and Peter Mandelson and so on trotting it out. And trotting it out deliberately, deceptively, because they run through the phrase dependent on our trade with the EU, knowing that a lot of people will hear that as dependent on our membership of the EU, which of course is a completely separate thing. We have a surplus with the rest of the world, excluding the EU. Our surplus with the rest of the world is more than cancelled out by our deficit with the EU, and that tells me that we would have a pretty strong negotiating position, because those of you who have been in business will know that it is not normal in any transaction for the salesman to be able to bully or threaten the customer. Ultimately, the customer has the stronger position. You're absolutely right about unilateral free trade, and it's worth looking at the door-stopping 500,000 word document by Business for Britain, which sketches out how a post-EU Britain might flourish. They make it's a very good way of getting around this, because there's a way of making people feel uncertain by saying, would we be in EFTA, would we be in the EEA, could we get the same deal that Guernsey gets or that Switzerland and something. So they've done something quite clever, which is to assume, ludicrously, that we get no kind of deal at all with the EU, except the minimum guaranteed by the World Trade Organization. Okay? Now, no one thinks that would be the case. No one in Brussels, no one in Britain doubts that we would get a free trade agreement, because after all, every country in Europe except Belarus and Russia are part of the European free trade area, right? The only assumption they make is that we would not apply tariffs ourselves. And so even in that absurd, conjectural, theoretical worst-case scenario, where we had absolutely no preferential import penetration at all to the rest of the EU, they still find that if you look at the cost of those tariffs and you look at what we'd be saving by no longer handing our 19 billion a year gross over to Brussels, we could compensate all of those sectors and still have 10 billion pounds a year left. So that for me just kind of wraps up the whole economic argument. That's why we are obviously going to be better off out. But of course, it will be much better than that, because in truth, as every single Eurocrat will tell you, on departure we would get a Swiss-type deal.
Thank you. Yes, gentlemen.
I'd like to ask Dan in particular. The government, and even George Osborne this morning, has been talking about getting out of ever closer union. But can I ask how that could be achieved, and particularly how it could be achieved if we're still judged by the European Court of Justice, and whether it would be possible to be in any form within the European Union without being governed by it?
You're quite right. It can't be. They're talking about getting out of the words, not getting out of the substance. So that's a very easy concession for the EU to make. Right? If all we want is to get a protocol saying that it doesn't apply to us, easy. I mean, I don't know how many of you heard the Chancellor. I get that the government has to downplay expectations. I understand that they are lowering expectations to an almost farcical degree. Nonetheless, to have the Chancellor of the Exchequer now defining success in the renegotiations as not joining the euro, I mean, come on. What would be a success? What would be a meaningful victory to bring back? Exactly what you just said, Roger. Right? That we replace the automatic jurisdiction of the European Court on our own territory with the primacy of Parliament, which seems to be a remarkably moderate and reasonable thing to ask for, living under our own laws and our own people in our own sovereign parliament, as every democracy in the world expects to do, except those in the European Union. Now, if that could be achieved, and it was something that the Prime Minister was originally talking about, then I think much would follow. That could be the basis of a very different relationship with the European Union, which I suspect most Bruges Group supporters will be able to live with. But the Foreign Secretary is now saying, oh, well, that's a bit difficult, so let's not ask for it. Now, maybe he has whole warrens of rabbits up his sleeve. I can only go on the basis of what he's saying. But what a missed opportunity if instead of reasserting the jurisdiction of our Parliament and becoming a sovereign country in free association with our neighbours, he is determined to keep, of all the EU's attributes, the one that ensures our status as a subunit or province within a European polity.
Thank you. I'll take a question from the gentleman just, towards the door. You, sir. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, Ian Walker from Sheffield Hannan. Thank you, Mr. Nick Legg. I had to endure his ridiculous comments in the election campaign when I stood against him. But I'm an engineer and a businessman. I think we do need to emphasise this case, this economic case. Both my businesses are export-driven businesses. 75% of our exports go beyond the EU. And I think this is very much special. I'm a member of the South Yorkshire International Trade Forum, and the very strong message there is if you're an exporting business, don't look to Europe. They may take your potatoes or low-value goods because they're close by. If you want high technology, high added value goods, they're global goods. You've got to look beyond Europe. And I think that message needs to get across in this campaign. Because people are worried about economics, but actually there's a strong economic case from economists, but also from engineers and business. We need to get the message across, I believe.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. I'll just take another question so these points can be addressed as well. You, sir.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. You were clearly preaching largely.
Graham Socially from Staffordshire, you were happy preaching to largely the converted and motivating us converted. How would you best recommend that we get the message to more people effectively enough to win the necessary referendum?
Okay. Well, one very practical step that I would urge everyone in this room to take is, while you're here in Manchester, go to the Conservatives for Britain stand. I mean, if you're a Conservative, obviously, if you're not Conservative, you're just in the room, then that would be a silly thing to do. But those of you who are Conservative Party members, because we're going to need to win this referendum with supporters in every party. There's a Labour for Britain organisation, there's a Green organisation, there's a Lib Dem one getting going, but there is also a large and successful Conservatives for Britain organisation chaired by my friend Steve Baker, with Nigel Lawson as its head or titular president. We need to know who is prepared to leaflet, who's prepared to put a poster in his window, and who's prepared to make the argument within the party. So if you haven't yet done so, please do take a minute to go to the Conservative for Britain stand and sign up with them.
Thanks, Dan. Any comment on those 2 points?
Well, at the beginning of this morning session, Dan said to me that he'd been on a panel with a couple of business people who keep on pounding on about the fact that the majority of business people want Britain to stay in the European Union. I don't believe that's true, and Dan doesn't believe that's true. So anyone who's a business person should actually stand up and be counted, like I've been today. It's not normally my forum, this, but I do feel very strongly that as it's currently constituted, we should leave the European Union and take that decision. It's not a radical decision, it's an easy one to make once you know the facts.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I'll take a question from, is it a lady towards the back there? Second one in? Was it a gentleman? Can't quite see my eyes. Yes, you say. Yes. Keep going back, keep going back.
Yeah, this is really mainly a question for Dan. Just in terms of what your thoughts are of how the referendum is going to play out next year, probably next year. And in particular, we've had 2 referendums during the last Parliament, Scotland and AV. You mentioned there was a tendency to think that people tend to prefer the status quo. Are there any lessons from those 2 referendums that you would draw on going forward?
Yes, be cheerful, be positive, and be optimistic. Don't let the outcome of the Scottish referendum blind us to what happened during the campaign. Alex Hannan began with a deficit of more than 20 points and finished with a deficit of only 10 points, defying the standard theory that there is always a swing to the status quo during the campaign itself. How did he do that? Well, apparently they invested in one session with a top American political consultant. And this consultant had one message for him, which is every campaign is won by the more optimistic sounding candidate. He apparently made all the SNP people do an exercise where he gave them bags of pennies and they had to put one on the table every time they said something grumpy or negative. Well, that chap, for once the phrase seems apt, was worth every penny, because if you look at what then happened in the campaign, the unionist side made the awful, elemental mistake of arguing about all the bad consequences that might happen if they didn't get their way. Oh, will we keep the pound? Will we be in the EU? Will there be disinvestment? And of course that very naturally provokes in people a bloody-mindedness, a sense of don't you tell us what's possible and what's impossible. Alex Hannan was a model of cheerfulness. All the doubts were swallowed up in this supernova of optimism. Ah, yes, we'll have problems, but they'll be our problems as an independent people, and I'm sure we can handle them. So, moving from Scotland to the EU campaign, it is very difficult to sound upbeat when you're moaning about fraud, or waste, or immigration, or the swatting aside of referendums, or any of these things. People may agree on every issue that you, every point you raise individually, but they don't like the collective impression of pessimism. You have to offer something better. If I can put it at its most simplest, if you are talking about Romanians and Bulgarians, or whatever the latest crisis is, it's very difficult to be holding out the vision of a better future. But if you're talking about a global Britain, about the immense opportunities that we have as a trading nation on more distant continents, then you can imbue your message with that hint of warmth, that breath of optimism that will carry us to victory.
Thank you very much indeed. Question by a gentleman, yes, with the shirt and the glasses. Yes, you, sir.
Thank you. I'm Dominic Searle from Gibraltar. We're always very appreciative of the support we have across the Conservatives, but we will be voting in this referendum, and we feel a little bit like we're going to be turkeys voting for Christmas. You mentioned Jersey, but Jersey has access to the single market. I think Switzerland does pay contributions to be where it is. But from where we see it, the day after Brexit, if it happens, nobody's thought about what's going to happen with us. Will we have an access to the market? The border will probably close with Spain. I just wondered where you thought we might be after Brexit.
Well, your First Minister is yet another Oriel graduate, and he told me, and he was a contemporary of mine, and he told me something fascinating. He said, the EU is very bad at upholding our rights when it comes to free movement. You know better than I do the issues with the border closure. He said, on the other hand, they are very good at upholding our responsibilities when it comes to things like banking regulation. Gibraltar is in a situation where it's getting a lot of the bad rules from the EU without any of the good ones. And I think, frankly, it is a no-brainer that you should upgrade to a Guernsey or Jersey type situation where you are inside the free market but outside everything else, including most of the financial services regulation. And if that's a good deal for Jim, isn't it also a good deal for the UK? I mean, one of the things I've found in politics is whenever you cite another country, however narrow and limited the context, you're always told an unrelated fact about that country. So if you say that we can learn from free schools in Sweden, oh yeah, but we're nothing like Sweden because they were neutral in the Second World War. And I found that whenever you point to Norway or Switzerland or Iceland as Western European and developed economies that are outside the EU, you're always told an unrelated thing that Norway has oil or that Switzerland took Nazi gold or something. All right, if even Switzerland is too exotic an example to be useful, because I have, Norway and Switzerland, according to the UN, are the two richest and best places to live in the world, right? If even those two don't work as examples, surely the Channel Islands. I mean, if we can't even draw a parallel with them, we might as well completely give ourselves over to solipsism and introversion. These are English-speaking common law territories. They watch the same TV as us. They have the same street signs as us. The Queen is their head of state. They are like us in every way except one. They're not in the European Union. Isn't that the obvious place to start looking for how a post-EU Britain would look? Under Protocol 3 of our accession, Jersey and Guernsey are in the common market and outside everything else, outside the common agricultural, fisheries, immigration, justice and home affairs, foreign policy. And you know what? They also seem to be doing pretty darn well at the moment. Guernsey had an economy based on tomatoes as late as the 1980s. Now it's a financial services hub because it's outside the European Union and not subject to some of the malign and pettifogging regulation that London has had to put up with from Brussels. The Chief Minister of Guernsey, who I was speaking to a couple of weeks ago, a very clever man, one of the last youngest people to speak Norman French as his first language. He studied in Paris. He said he feels very European, but he said the critical advantage for me is people can get rid of a policy if they don't like it, and they can get rid of me if they don't like it. And I thought, how diminished we are as a democracy, that should need saying, that we should now be, we who developed and exported parliamentary supremacy, should now be in a position of casting envious glances at Guernsey.
Jim, have you got any...
Well, I was just going to say, I completely agree with Dan, but he omitted to mention the Isle of Man, where I live. And we've had 30 years of uninterrupted economic growth. One of the things, and we are in exactly the same, well, pretty well the same situation as Guernsey and Jersey. But one of the things that hasn't been discussed is the ability to set your own tax rates. And there is definitely pressure coming from Brussels to normalise or to equalise taxes. That will be a disaster for the UK. We have a low rate of corporation tax, very attractive to inward investment, which will continue to be the case. We can lower it even further, we can flatten our taxes. We did that within the new federal European Union, the kind of train that, or the bus that will not stop, will be under severe pressure and it may not happen. So I think taxes are another positive point for us to say no.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, gentleman on the side. Thank you.
Edward Johnson, Burnley and Pendle, UK. With great respect to everyone here, the only reason we're having a referendum is because of the party I belong to, but I'm not here to praise what we've achieved with our 4 million votes. That's just in reference to introduce myself. 1975, I voted no. My question is, should there be one umbrella organisation for the out campaign where everybody is under the same plan, or should it be individual groups? Thank you.
Jim, would you like to lead off with your thoughts?
Well, Dan is better qualified to answer this, but I would say that of course it's better to have one organisation that represents a single voice, which is no. It may not happen because, you know, political parties have different agendas and so forth, but it would be much better if it did happen, and I hope it does. That having been said, it looks to me, as an outside observer, that the No campaign is getting much better momentum than the Yes campaign, which as yet hasn't made a single positive argument for us staying in the European Union, other than it would be a disaster if we left, which is the pessimism that Dan was talking about, which is not the way that you want to campaign. So I'm pretty optimistic on this, and I think what we all need to look at are the bookmakers' odds on this, because they're always, or most of the time, right. And they are narrowing. It's saying it's going to be a very close contest. We can win this.
Thank you.
Well,
Dan.
in a way, that is the decision for us, because we have statutory procedures on the conduct of referendums. We've had them since the Political Parties and Referendums Act, and they lay down that there will be a designated organisation on each side, which has a spending limit. The parties are then separate from that and have their own spending limits outside that envelope. And of course, outside, there will be other groups, inevitably on both sides, and there's room for everyone around this table. Right? One of these organisations will get the designation. That's going to be a decision made by the Electoral Commission. And I think, the mainstream Eurosceptic organisations have all indicated that they will work with whoever gets that designation. And that's also my own view. In the meantime, we should be working to get our own constituencies out. The Labour, the Green, the UKIP, the Lib Dems, all of them should be speaking to their own constituencies, which is why I repeat, if you're a Conservative, do please sign up to Conservatives for Britain. That's our own internal party one. And I very much agree with what Jim said about how winnable this is. Whenever you have the argument, you realise that our arguments are simple, intelligible, and effective. People understand about the loss of control, they understand about the loss of democracy, they understand about the 19 billion we're handing over every year, they understand about migration. The other side has one argument, which is fear of change. And frankly, once that's been neutralised, this is going to be more than
Thank you. Right down the front there.
Hi, I'd like to add actually to your question. I'm Caroline Stevens. I'm the campaign group manager for the No.eu, which renamed last week as the Leave.eu. We did an analysis of the membership. You basically sign up on our website. We're an apolitical campaign group. 40% so far are UKIPers, 28% are Labour supporters, and 20% of Conservatives. So we're looking to boost our membership in the Conservative department. So, it's an apolitical group. So that's another group that you could be thinking of joining. And maybe together we can do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. If we come out of the EU, how is that going to affect food production in this country, farming? We rely at the moment on the subsidies, and farmers are making possibly more out of the subsidies than they're making out of growing beef, sheep and arable and dairy in this country. It's pretty depressing, but how's it going to affect British agriculture?
Dan, would you like to...
Sorry, the reason I was smiling is because the questioner knows he puts this, he's a constituent of mine and he raises this question with me regularly. And he's going to get the same answer. Britain is a food importing nation with an efficient agricultural sector. We are penalised both positively and negatively by the CAP. We pay more into it than anybody else. We get less out of it than anybody else. We are not cheaply subsidising our farmers under the CAP. We are subsidising their rivals across the channel. If we pulled out of the CAP, saved that money, we would be able to give every British farmer a generous acreage-based grant while still saving billions of pounds a year. Okay? Now, we'll need to go through the figures, but I wouldn't have thought it's at all unrealistic to be looking at being able to say that for a transitional period of 10, 15 years or whatever, we would guarantee a subsidy of 80, 90 pounds an acre to every farmer, which would leave them better off, while still leaving the country as a whole vastly better off as taxes and food prices fall.
Thank you. Yes, I take a question from the gentleman. Yes, blue shirt. Yes, you sir.
Thank you very much. I think one of the frustrations I've certainly had, and I think a lot of people, is that we don't really know what's in the mind of David Cameron. And can I please say that I'm a great supporter of him in many, many respects. But at this stage, he seems to be confused, quite frankly, about how to handle the situation. I spoke to him in a private lunch in 2008, and he made it absolutely clear that at all costs we had to stay in the EU because of the common market. Now, I have some practical experience. I work with a company in very high-grade, clinically proven on humans, pharmaceutical-grade nutritional supplements from America. And most of those were allowed under British English or British regulations. The company decided that once we had signed the Lisbon Treaty, within 2 years, all the best supplements were pulled off the market by them because they weren't prepared to have more than one product that fitted what David Cameron said was a common market. It is not a common market. There are 22 countries out of 28 that still have their own regulations in that big billion-dollar industry.
Thank you very much. Jim, would you like to comment?
Well, I think I'm in the biosciences industry for a large part of my time, and I know what you're talking about, which is that basically the European Medical Association, its Medicines Agency rather, is not uniform. You know, if you get approval in one country, it doesn't necessarily get approval in another country. So I see where you're coming from. Well, just another reason to be positive about our campaign, right?
Exactly.
Thank you. Dan, any comments on this issue?
Only to repeat that there is a pan-European market which is continental and is much wider than the EU. When people talk about the single market, it's terribly important to understand what they mean. They don't mean a tariff-free zone. They don't mean mutual product recognition. And they don't mean free movement of goods and services. What they mean is a common regulatory system, as you say, an imperfect one, but nonetheless one which has common rules that can be imposed on everybody else. Now, from Iceland to Turkey, you have a European common market. There are perhaps 40, 45 states and territories that are in that free trade area. Norway, Monaco, Macedonia, Isle of Man, Serbia, and so on. Within that, there are then 28 members of the European Union. It is terrifically important to stress that ceasing to be one of those 28, withdrawing from the political institutions, from the European arrest warrant and so on, does not mean leaving the European market. When last year the EU signed association agreements with Moldova and Ukraine, it left only one European country outside that market. Actually, the Ukrainian association turned out to have rather bigger consequences than they'd been planned at the time, but not because of the free trade. The only the only European country that is not part of a European market is Belarus. Does anyone seriously suggest that Britain would not get the same deal that Switzerland or Guernsey or Macedonia or Turkey has? No one in Brussels is suggesting that.
Thank you. Okay, yes, gentleman on the gangway there.
Terry Langford, commercial fisherman. Would you agree that the money that we pay into the EU, being the second highest after Germany, is not really the full figure? Because when you consider that we gave away a multi-billion-pound fishing industry, which we've got to have equal access, which is not equal, because we've got 80% of it and we can only have part of it, do you agree that we pay in as much as Germany?
Thank you. Jim?
Well, on fisheries specifically, we used to have a very vibrant fisheries industry, and it's been decimated by Spanish, Icelandic and others who come into what used to be our waters. And I feel that the restoration of national sovereignty by leaving the European Union would be very positive for our fishing industry, which used to be a very important industry and is now withered because of directly the consequence of the European Union. I agree with you.
Thank you.
And I hope you'll be setting up a Fishermen for Britain organisation. I know, we've known each other for a long time, and I know you have great contacts.
Thank you very much. Yes, you sir.
Given the microphone, sorry, thank you. Given Grahamwood from York, given the total democratic deficit in the European Union and the economic disaster that we've heard about this afternoon, which I think we all totally agree with, this is a political question. Why do you think a substantial number of Conservative MPs and across in Liberal and Labour parties are so obtuse, are so unaware of the facts that you've outlined this afternoon?
Thank you. Dan, you may.
Milton Friedman had a great phrase, the tyranny of the status quo. Sometimes I think you need to have actually been in politics to see what a brilliantly perspicacious observation that was. The tyranny of the status quo. It doesn't just mean that people are small c conservatives, that we're change averse, although by and large that is how we're wired. It also means that a bureaucracy, a corpus of vested interests will grow up around whatever happens to be the established dispensation. And that's what's happening. Ask yourselves, if we were not now in the EU, if our fathers had had the common sense to do what the Swiss did and negotiated a free trade only deal, do you imagine that any serious Labour or Conservative politicians would now be arguing that we should join? I mean, you only have to put the question. Why are we in? Because not only within government, not only within the machinery of the state, but around it, in the municipalities, in the NGOs, in the big corporations, there are people for whom it is now a question not of sovereignty or democracy, but of mortgages and school fees. There is a large group of people, contractors, consultants, and above all these NGOs getting money directly from Brussels, who now have an immediate, direct, vested interest in the European project. I mean, if I pluck an example more or less from the air, Oxfam got 46 million euros from the EU last year. Guess what position Oxfam takes on whether we should be in the EU, right? And multiply that by every other NGO, every large corporation that employs lobbyists there and so on. That's what we're up against. And that's why it's going to be such a difficult thing to dislodge.
Jim, have you got any views on the vested interests?
I applaud Dan for taking a principled and right-minded approach, because the fact is that if you do take the stay in the European Union approach, you're going up against the big guys in the Conservative Party, and you're denied high office, and that is a very strong attraction to career politicians. And so it's great, and I think we should all applaud him, that Dan has taken the opposite view and is standing up for principles rather than...
Okay, gentlemen with the glasses? Yes, you sir. Back of it, there he is, stand.
The Conservatives of Britain, it'd be helpful to know what stand you're on, because I can't find it in the booklet. But that's not really my question. The life after leaving the EU is what we're here for. There are uncertainties about agriculture, and we've heard us sort of, well, it's easy for us to do this. Why can't we get the groups who are opposed to staying in the EU to work out what aspects, how we meet needs like agriculture? And there are aspects of what's going on in the EU which are actually, I think, useful. We can draw some good things out of the EU. And one of my... well, consumer protection. There's some very good consumer protection issues where consumers are protected against chemicals in all sorts of products. I think that's a scheme that works well, and I think...
Okay, that's good.
But there are more things like that, where there are good things. Okay. How do we deal with it?
Thank you so much, sir. We'll take another question at the same time before I throw it back to the panel. Yes, gentleman just here.
Philip Carr from Skipton. My question is, I think Daniel Hannan was saying all organisations are constantly changing. What would be the impact on the EU of a positive Brexit?
Okay, right. Dan, would you like to lead
Okay,
off?
very quickly. Stand 64. That was the easier part of the questions. Conservatives were brilliant. Can be found in the conference centre at stand 64. What would be the impact of Brexit? Here's my guess. I think it would catalyse a positive change throughout the EU. Certainly in the more peripheral, more free trading, more Atlanticist countries. I think some of the other member states that are sceptical of political integration, Sweden, Denmark, maybe even Ireland, might seek a similar free trade only deal. And I'm certain that the EFTA countries, the Caucasian countries, the Balkan states, Turkey, would also want to bring their arrangements into line with ours. So it would be possible to envisage a broad, pan-European free market along the lines of NAFTA, or EFTA, or ASEAN, stretching, as I say, from Iceland to Turkey and Armenia, within which you then have, I don't know, 15, 18, 20, 25, however many countries that want to have the euro and the common president, the common foreign policy. Doesn't that make everybody happy? It allows the federalist countries to pursue their vision unimpeded, and it gives us and the other peripheral countries the free market rather than the common government, which is what we thought we were coming for. They would lose a bad tenant and they'd gain a good neighbour.
Thank you. I'll take two questions now, one for the gentleman here and then the lady behind you.
Gary Robinson, Bruges member. This question is for Dan. Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty requires the EU to sign a settlement with any country that leaves, but it's notoriously vague on what that settlement would look like. But Article 8 of the treaty says that the EU must form a close relationship with any neighbouring country, which of course we would be if we left. So the question is, what form of settlement do you think would be offered to us after the 2-year Article 50 period?
So, okay, we'll take the lady just behind before we come back to Article 50.
Gloria Martin, Bruges Group member. This is especially for Daniel. Cameron backed down on the Purdah period. Do you think he will also back down and allow his ministers a free vote? And do you ever get any whispers in your ear?
Well, on Gloria's thing, I mean, he isn't even backing down, he hasn't taken a view. I have been very pleasantly surprised by how fair-minded the party machine has been on this. I was expecting the Conservative Party to stay within the letter of technical neutrality, while in fact doing as much as it could to get the outcome it wanted. But there's no sign of that happening at all. Much to my pleasant surprise, they have been absolutely neutral in spirit as well as in letter. They said MPs can campaign on either side, the party won't use its designation to give money to either side, the logo won't be used, staff of the party machine can take unpaid leave to campaign for either side. So that is genuine neutrality, and you really can't say fairer than that. And I hope that the other divided party, which is Labour, will do the same, although it seems unlikely. What would be the outcome what kind of deal would we be left in? The day before yesterday I was debating against Nick Legg at the Cheltenham Festival, and even he absolutely accepted that there was no question of Britain's market access being prejudiced. He absolutely didn't dispute, in fact he gladly conceded at the outset that we would still be in the single market, although he was fretting, of course, about losing, as Jim said, our 10% say over the formulation of rules within part of that market. It is inconceivable, and nobody in Brussels is suggesting that we would not continue to enjoy free movement of goods and services. We have, to repeat, a big trade deficit with the EU, only partly offset by our surplus with the rest of the world. And in any case, WTO rules make it very difficult to go from a more favourable to a less favourable relationship with a state with whom you already have a trade deal. So even if they wanted to, which there is no evidence that anyone is suggesting, they would find it very difficult to impose non-tariff or tariff barriers on the EU. So this is not a question about the common market. This is not a rerun of the 1975 referendum. This is a question of whether we want to be part of all the other things leading to the creation of a European state.
Jim, have you any points to add on that?
Well, it'll be interesting because the question was asked, has Dan been whispered in his ear? You didn't actually answer that one.
I'm past that, so they don't try with it.
But the point is that, and I'm going to ask Dan this question, in the event of a no vote, which is increasingly likely, presumably there's going to be a change in our national government.
Well, yes, I think that would follow. I mean, this is what I find puzzling about the attitude of some conservatives. The thing I was sketching out a moment ago, the idea of a sort of pan-European free trade area with a smaller suffrage, that's going to come one way or the other, right? We could get it through an amicable renegotiation now, but mystifyingly, British ministers, so far anyway, have not even been asking for it. So the way to get to that deal is to vote to leave and then do it from the outside, right? Fine, I'm happy with it either way, but as you say, David Cameron would have had to have resigned. The Foreign Secretary would have had to have resigned. And I'm guessing if he, and I don't know why he decided to make it his thing, but the Chancellor would have had to have resigned, because he's decided to lead the campaign to stay in. So the consequences for them would be rather big, which makes me think, why then not negotiate that at the outset? Since we're going to get there anyway, why all of you have to throw your careers away? It's very, very bewildering.
Okay, I'll take another question from this lady at the front. We haven't had many questions from ladies, so to try and equal things up. I'll take a question from you. Could you make a question directly to our...
Two questions.
I would just question that, Dan, because our campaign group tried to get a stall at the Conservative Party conference, and we did the same with Labour, UKIP and the SNP conference venues. The Conservatives banned us. So why would they do that if they were sort of outward-looking and free-thinking and not whispering in people's ears? But yet Labour Party accepted our stall.
You made that good point very well. Dan? I have no idea. I mean, that's not my decision. But as I say, the question of who's going to be the group is going to be made by the Electoral Commission, and I hope we will all get behind it, whoever it is.
Yes, gentleman right at the back. Yes, you, sir, with the blue tie.
Steve Stanley, UKIP's party director during the general election. The Conservative Party has always been, or increasingly, is regarded as a Eurosceptic party. Increasingly, the centre of gravity is Euroscepticism. And yet a recent survey showed that over 200 Conservative MPs were still agnostic on the key issue of in or out. And so my question is the Conservative Parliamentary Party genuinely representative of the rank and file here in this today's modern Conservative Party? And if they're not, what will the Conservative membership do to force those MPs to actually represent your views?
Thank you very much. I think this is probably a question for you, Dan.
I think it is important to recognise that there are sincere and patriotic people on both sides of this question, and that when the referendum has taken place, we will need to get back together and continue the task of running the country. I say that as someone who is confident of winning, but if we don't win, I will accept the result with good grace, and that will be it. There's absolutely no point in going in for witch hunts or saying things that you then can't unsay. Conservative MPs will be aware of a whole bunch of competing pressures, what their whips are saying, what their associations are saying, what their constituents are saying, and in the end they will make a conscious, or maybe a careerist decision, but they will make their own decisions. Having made that, there's no point in shouting abuse at people or trying to scare them. We have to convince with better arguments. If our arguments are as good as we think they are, we're going to win.
Thank you. Yes, gentleman here on the front row. Can you just speak? I think we can hear you from here.
Okay. Alan Holt. Sorry, thank you.
Alan Holsall, Business for Britain. I'd just like to ask both gentlemen. I've run a small business over many years and have dealt with EU regulations, safety matters, etc., etc. And we have directive after regulation after directive hitting our product. And yet we find in the last couple of weeks there's the most enormous regulatory breach by VW and what has gone on there. And that wasn't even picked up in Europe at all. It had to be picked up by our American friends. Can I ask both Jim and Daniel why they felt that we spend all this money on regulation, all this money on people to enforce regulation inside the EU, and yet we cannot even pick up probably the biggest regulatory blunder since, well, for years and years. Thank you.
Jim, I think you'll probably have some views.
Well, it's now known as Carmageddon, the Volkswagen thing. And the problem was known as early as 2012, but was basically shushed up by the European Union in its various guises. And as you rightly point out, the Americans, probably with an eye on the $18 billion or so fines that the US Treasury is going to extract from Volkswagen, were the ones to move on it. But, you know, we are a very compliant nation. As I understand it, we comply more with these directives than any other country. The Italians probably turn a blind eye, and the French, you know, sort of go half-heartedly on it. What you're talking about, of course, is another reason to write our own rules, which suit us. Now, that doesn't mean to say that every directive from Brussels is a useless directive, but it is a Parkinsonian project, the largest Parkinsonian project in the world. And as you know, that means that bureaucracies naturally expand till their eventual limits, when we're all bureaucrats. And that is what is going to happen in Europe if it carries on its current course. So you're right.
Thank you very much indeed. Next question. Yes, gentleman there in the glasses. Yes.
Question to Jim.
The question to Jim, you said that it's an easy decision to make once you know the facts.
Yeah.
And does George Osborne not know the facts, or is he capable of making an easy decision? And
well, I can't speak for him. I'm speaking as a private citizen. I'm not a politician. But I do question why they have such an ideological view of Europe. Because, as I said, you know, you should have an open mind. You should look at all the facts. I did say at the outset of my talk that at the moment it's an easy decision. But if there was a really good renegotiation of the type that Dan has been talking about, then we might reconsider our position vis-à-vis Europe. I said at the beginning, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of a small mind. I try and keep an open mind, but at the facts as they are at the moment, mitigate against a yes vote and strongly militate towards a no vote. That's the way I see it.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, gentleman. Yes, you sir. Blue tie. Yes. Thank you.
Brian Weller. After we leave, hopefully, how we must make sure that other countries get out of the EU as well, and instead of allowing the European Union to become a United States of Union on our doorstep without our veto power. Thank you.
Okay, Dan, you've...
Well, actually, I'm not sure that that is in our power. I think if we leave the EU, the consequence may be that some of the other member states do decide to complete the task that they keep publicly setting themselves of forming a single united federal state. And the flip side of leaving is that we accept that that's going to happen. It's our failure to accept that that's the choice that has led us to our present unhappy situation. So if once we've left, it's not our business or our problem. I just wanted to come back to the really important point that Alan Holsall, the saviour of Silver Cross prams, made a moment ago about the diesel, the EU's decision, uniquely in the world pretty much, to decide to go down the road of diesel rather than anything else as a way of tackling CO2 emissions. Now, I'm not suggesting that the motives were other than good. I'm sure that they all thought they were doing the right thing. But we now know, I mean, there's no point in denying the facts here. We now know that the EU incentivized, through tax and through regulation, a policy that caused tens of thousands of needless deaths through air pollution. Right? That's the truth of what happened, as we've discovered since the VW scandal. And you've got to go back and look at a number of the decisions that the EU makes in the regulatory sphere. It is favouring diesel over much cleaner and healthier petrol. It is favouring wood chip burners over much cleaner and healthier shale. It is favouring pesticides over cleaner and healthier GM. And bizarrely, it is favouring smoking tobacco over vaping. And that's what happens when you get vested interests and cartels capturing the regulatory process and using it in a way that suits their commercial interest rather than the interest of the citizen.
Jim, you outlined a very interesting scenario earlier with the debt crisis across the EU. Following on from this question, how do you think that's going to impact the future relations of countries? Will there be more countries leaving the EU under those circumstances and looking for a different relationship?
Well, I would have thought so. I mean, if you get a situation in which Germany is the only paymaster and trying to bail out the rest of the European Union, something's got to fracture. I actually do believe that the European Union will be reformed, having broken up, in possibly the way that we would like in 10 to 15 years' time, at which point we can look to whether we rejoin it or not. But for the moment, as I said, we're in the Titanic's wake. We're going to be sucked down without a lifeboat. If we vote no, we'll have a very luxuriously appointed lifeboat to watch the carnage on the high seas.
Thank you. Okay. Can I take a question about the gentleman at the back there? Michelle, thank you.
Thank you very much. Malcolm Guy, I'm afraid UKIP again, from Ripon and Skipton. I wanted to take up the point of the gentleman who spoke about agriculture, that when the Yes campaign do get together, I think they're going to be stressing some of the few beneficiaries, net beneficiaries of the 55 million we pay a day. For instance, ironically, at our conference across the road was a Doncaster School for the Deaf flying a European flag, because I'm sure they are net beneficiaries. And I'm concerned that the net beneficiaries will think that if we come out, they're going to lose that funding, and we've got to get it across that coming out of Europe doesn't detract from people who are net beneficiaries still benefiting, because we'll have surplus funds anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that point. I'll also take a question from the gentleman on the side there.
David Bruges from Anglesey. Assuming that we manage to win this referendum and get out, is the government honour bound to get us out, or will they favour?
Dan, would you like to comment on these 2 points, the likelihood of havering?
Okay, well, on the net beneficiaries point, I've already made the important exception of farmers. I think it would be too big a wrench to go straight from the CAP to a total unknown, which could be a New Zealand type situation or could be an agricultural one. So I think we need to put in place publicly and clearly, as the Leave campaign, what our alternative agriculture policy should be, and I think it has to leave farmers at least as well off or better off than now. That does not apply to the various NGOs, charities and universities getting funds to say pro-Brussels things. I don't think there's any way that we're going to be able to promise to match all of that. We're just going to have to accept that a number of NGOs, for reasons of immediate self-interest, are going to be on the other side. In terms of are we going to haver, how would we implement a vote to leave? And we all know what happens when a country votes against the EU. Okay, it's happened in Denmark, it's happened in Ireland, happened in France and the Netherlands, it's just happened in Greece. Right? They don't take no for an answer. We know that. So what would happen in the event of Britain voting to leave? I suspect that would not be the end. That would be the beginning of a new round of talks. There'd be many more serious renegotiations and more concessions put on the table. And we would then end up with something much more like the dispensation I was talking about, of a pan-European market within which you had a smaller federal sub-group. If, on the other hand, we vote to stay in, does anyone imagine they're going to ask us again? I mean, that's it then. You have given your consent to everything that comes down the track from that moment on. Common tax policy, common army, common police force, whatever it is. They're never going to come back and ask us. And so that's why, if you're in any doubt, you should vote no for better terms.
Thank you very much. Now, we're coming towards the end of this session, as our speakers have other commitments. I'll take the final 2 questions, one from this gentleman here, and another from the gentleman just over there.
Yes, Brian Tustain, Conservative Stratford-upon-Avon. There are a great many Eurosceptics in our party, myself included, and I think out of respect for David Cameron, 1 or 2 of my members are going to wait until the outcome of the renegotiations. I just wondered, looking at Daniel, what does he think that David Cameron will achieve from the negotiations? What is, I don't know what's expected. I think there's a great many people, including, by the way, members of Parliament, who are waiting to see the outcome of the renegotiations.
Thank you. And the gentleman in the middle there. Yes, you, sir.
Hello, Brian Price. I think that if we're going to win this referendum, we need to get our arguments together, and I suggest we probably need to get the facts together and keep them simple. I think it would help me, anyway, hugely, if I could see some up-to-date figures of what we buy from Germany and what we sell to Germany, what we buy from France, what we sell from France, and so on. There's a huge deficit in our favour. We buy many more Mercedes cars and BMWs and VWs and so on, and Siemens products than we sell to Germany. We need to know what those figures are, and we need to know them both for manufactured goods and for services goods in as up-to-date position as we can get them. And then we will be in a position to neutralise the CBI, which stands up time and time again and says, oh, it's a big market and really it's very helpful and so on and so on, and they've done no analysis. That's one point. The second point I'd like to make is the gentleman over there who said that he sold 75% or more of his trade outside the EU. It may well be remembered that in 1972 we sold 75% or more of our total trade outside the EU, and of course it went down when we were put into the restrictive trap that we were put into. If we could get out of that trap, it would help us hugely. And if, as a final point, if we could get the right to fix our own trade agreements, then we would get the right to trade where we can, where we want to, and we would get that 75% up to where it should be. Thank you.
Jim, would you like to lead off on these 2 points?
On the last 2 points, yeah. Well, it's obvious. It's like going to a supermarket. You can only see half the aisles. You're restricted in your choice, and I think this is all down to choice. Our choice on the outside of Europe is much greater than our choice on the inside. And in terms of, Dan put it very well, in terms of the expansion of our trade around the world, we need to be outside the grip of the European Union, which doesn't make the necessary bilateral agreements on our behalf. So, yes, we should become a great trading nation again. We are not in terms of traded goods at the moment, we are in terms of services, and we're not going to get there unless we are able to make our own deals. It's exactly what Dan said.
In terms of equipping ourselves with the facts, if you really want the encyclopedic case, I refer you again to that 500,000 doorstopper of a book produced by Business for Britain, of which they have, of course, produced more digestible summaries. And I'm going to plug again Conservatives for Britain, which have a load of stuff on their stand in the main hall. But I'd like to answer those party members who are saying, let's wait. Party members, citizens of throughout the country who are saying, let's wait and see, which is, of course, a perfectly pragmatic and reasonable position. Interesting that of the 4 leadership contenders in the Labour Party, there was only one moderate on this question, and that was Jeremy Corbyn. He was the only one saying, let's wait and see. The other 3 said, there are no circumstances where we would ever need, it might mean more unemployment, it might mean poverty, it might mean destitute, but there are no circumstances. And weirdly, in the kind of BBC's discourse, it's his position that was considered doctrinaire and theirs that was considered reasonable. What would it take to convince me to back David Cameron's renegotiation? What would he need to bring back to get me to vote yes? I can give you a very long list of things that I want in a perfect world, but I'll boil it down to 3 things. Opting out of the non-economic parts of membership, many of which were only really introduced in Maastricht. This is not going back all that far. Foreign affairs, defence, farming, fishing, employment law, justice and home affairs, migration. Point 1. Point 2. Ability to sign a bilateral free trade agreement with Australia or India if the EU is being unduly protectionist. That doesn't even necessarily mean completely scrapping the common external tariff. It means that where new technologies are developing, there shouldn't be an assumption that we can't act without Brussels. Point 3, supremacy of our law. EU legal acts should come into effect in this country only following an explicit implementing decision by our own parliament. We would then be a sovereign country in free association with our allies, rather than being a province of a larger European entity. According to a survey in Conservative Home, this policy, which I set out on their website a while ago, has the support of 84% of party members and is opposed by only 8%, because I don't think it is an immoderate thing to ask for. The right to live under our own laws and our own people in our own sovereign parliament. I think it has support throughout the EU, and yet bizarrely, the Foreign Secretary is saying, oh, we mustn't ask for that, it's too difficult. Well, if that's our attitude going into the renegotiation, then logically you have to start preparing now to fight the campaign to leave.
Thank you very much indeed. We've had an excellent meeting which has exceeded my expectations. I'd like to say a special word to Jim Mellon. I've tried persistently to get businessmen to come up and stand on a Bruges Group platform and debate these issues, and I really haven't been able to get them. I've even approached people that have been ennobled by David Cameron, who supposedly had some interest in politics as well as prepared to put some money into politics, and they've not been prepared to come and stand on a platform and put over a point of view. Today from Jim, we've had an absolutely expert and detailed analysis. We've had an analysis from a different point of view than anybody that has spoken at the Bruges Group before. And we're very grateful to Jim also for spending this time with us. Jim is an immensely busy man with business and investment all over the world. And the fact that he's actually come today and give us some time and to enable us to see the insights that he has into these great issues is to be greatly applauded and greatly appreciated. Jim. Dan has given his usual flawless display and his command of these issues. And I think the meeting that we've had today augurs extremely well for the campaign that we face probably over the next 2 years. Everything we've heard has been informative, cohesive and articulate. And I think that really is going to be a winning combination for a campaign. If we can go forward in this way, putting forward these arguments that we know are true and know will appeal to the British people, put forward by people with expertise and understanding, yes, we will triumph and we will take Britain out of the European Union.